good afternoon, and welcome to Saturday Sesh. My name is Trey Reckling. I'm the founder and director of Academy of Cannabis Science, and we've been doing this work for nearly 10 years here, based out of Seattle, Washington, serving the cannabis community, trying to increase everybody's cannabis IQ a little bit, our Canna IQ. And we're here today joined by a nice selection, a group of our students, our Canna fam, so to speak, to talk with a very special guest, Ashley Anstett. Ashley Anstett is, and here, let me add her to the picture. Ashley's a subject matter expert when it comes to trauma and trauma-informed care. She has worked not only as a university professor, she is a subject matter expert working for the state of Oregon, where she helps employees understand the importance of this language, of understanding how trauma affects the brain, and likewise, how can we respond to folks, communicate better with folks, and that sort of thing. And I'll tell you, this was a relatively new subject for me just in the last couple of years, but it has helped me well outside of work, well outside of the 9 to 5. And so we do hope that this conversation will broaden your perspective a little bit, give you a little bit different insight to maybe interactions you already have every day. And do want to say, today is not going to be, although we're talking about trauma, our intention is also to keep this space safe for everybody. So if anybody should start sharing personal stories that could cause trauma for other folks, I will likely interrupt you, okay? Because we're going to be talking theory and stuff today, and not personal stories, because we don't want to do that to you, right? If you want to find out more about that, there are plenty that you can dive into. But Ashley, thank you very much for joining us. I know I gave just a thumbnail sketch about some of the work you've done, but you've trained with a lot of different audiences. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for having me today. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Ashley Anstett. I use she, her pronouns. And yeah, I'll just tell you a little bit about my background and how I come to the place I am right now. So in terms of career work, I started working in this field pretty early on. This is something that I've been really interested in. And not just trauma and how it impacts people, but sort of the overall structure of oppression, racism, sexism, etc., sort of structural oppression and how that impacts people, and then trauma on top of that. So I started in school. I was really interested in this, and I did some work when I went to Evergreen State College, and I did some work at the Green Hill School, which is a maximum security prison for youth. And I worked there with youth that were incarcerated, and I really discovered that that was the place that I felt like I connected. From my own history, from my own stuff, I was like, yeah, connecting with youth that have had trouble is really a place that I felt that I was going to do good work. So I did that. Those youth were incarcerated. It was a maximum security facility for youth that had been incarcerated for sex offenses. And so they were offenders, folks that had committed violence, but also had experienced a bunch of trauma. And then I came back down to Portland and I started working with domestic violence offenders. And then from there, started working with survivors of domestic sex trafficking, ages 12 to 25, and doing a lot of work within the criminal legal system within that realm. And so helping folks within the criminal legal system learn how to better work with survivors, because they're often taught how to work with offenders, but not often taught how to work with folks that have experienced violence. So did a lot of work in that realm and worked with a number of survivors, took that work to the Attorney General's Sexual Assault Task Force and started working statewide, helping to educate folks around trauma, its impact on the brain, and how to work with survivors. Then from there, went to Department of Justice to help implement some training and grant stuff around providing trauma-informed education to folks in the criminal legal system, because we understand that that's a space that they could use more training around how to work with folks that have experienced trauma. And then finally, now I am at the employment department working with Paid Leave Oregon as their trauma-informed program analyst. So that is sort of career-wise how I have ended up in this spot. And then really just like personally came to this from my own experiences, really wanted to contribute and help folks understand how people are impacted by trauma and how we can better create services for that.
Thank you very much. And as we'll talk about, trauma is one widespread and very common.
Yep.
Some research, as you have helped me understand, some research shows that 70% of adult Americans, or just Americans in general, have experienced trauma. And I would argue, coming out of the pandemic, the number's probably higher than that still.
Yep.
Um, and so it's widespread, and it affects the way our brains work, right?
Mhm.
So we'll talk about that a little bit. And I would like to show some slides here just to give us some common language to talk about a little bit. And let's do this. I know, there we go. So just as and Ashley, you're welcome to jump in here at any point, but wanted to give us a little common vocabulary. So trauma is, in one definition, an emotional, psychological, physical response to an event or series of events that are deeply distressing or disturbing.
Mhm.
It can lead to an overwhelm. It's more than our brains can handle, really, right? It's more than our current capacity. Not that we're unable to process it in time, but especially in the moment, it tweaks our system out. And imagine your own computer. If you got too many things open, it crashes, right? It doesn't function right. It slows down. It acts quirky, and the same thing can happen with our brains. So, Ashley, do you want to talk a little bit about this? We know that there are many characteristics of trauma, and
Yep.
we don't want to stereotype anybody that's been through it, but these are relatively common.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So I appreciate that you first put overwhelming stress on there because I think a lot of people can relate to having stress. Not everybody relates to experiencing a trauma, right? And the 70% of folks that you talked about, that's a statistic from the Trauma Treatment Collective. And so those are folks that have acknowledged, like, yes, there has been something traumatic. We know that adults experience stress, and particularly toxic stress, at higher rates than that 70%, and it impacts the brain in the exact same way. What we know is when the brain is impacted by trauma or toxic stress, we're overwhelmed. So that sort of processing function goes offline a little bit in order to conserve energy, because our brain's main function is to keep us alive. So that overwhelming stress is a characteristic of trauma because our executive function is disrupted. And so we have a hard time making decisions. We have a really difficult time putting things in perspective. Things feel very big. We're rigid often when we're feeling that stress. Another one I appreciate is that disruption of safety. That's sort of the number one thing for our brains, is that feeling of not being safe. And when that prefrontal cortex goes offline, I'm going to do the brain hand model. Is that okay while we talk about this?
Sure,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay, so I'm not sure if folks have seen this before, and I can't see you all. So if you have and you're nodding, forgive me because I'm going to go over it again. This is Dr. Dan Siegel's hand model of the brain, and he uses this as a very simplified explanation of some of the things that are happening in our brain when we are experiencing trauma and toxic stress. And like Trey talked about, that overwhelming stress, or like we talked about, that overwhelming stress can make that prefrontal cortex go offline. And I'm not sure if anybody has heard the term they flipped their lid, but that's what that is, right? That overwhelming stress takes us offline. And that can disrupt our feeling of safety, because then we start functioning from our amygdala, which is our fear center. And that is, again, keeping us safe, where we're responding particular ways. But that disruption of safety is an important characteristic because it's difficult for us to get back. And folks that have experienced trauma or toxic stress will sense threat in more places than people that have not. And so that disruption of safety, even if folks are not intending to be unsafe, somebody that has experienced trauma or toxic stress may feel it's unsafe because their brain's trying to keep them protected, right? And so that disruption of safety is really important. And then the impact on daily life is all of those things together, right? Folks can be continually activated by that stress or trauma, and that can be impact daily life because of memory, attention, brain function, etc.
And we know from research that two people can experience the same event and
Yes.
process it and be affected by it very differently, right? And you all know this if you've ever been in a maybe a car accident with somebody, and you might walk away and say, "Hey, I'm unharmed, I'm okay, that was unfortunate," and the other person might be really shaken up and doesn't want to get back in the car, or it really lingers with them. So each of us also, there's that variety in the way that we experience and process these things too.
And can I also say on top of that,
Please.
the in addition to that piece, so let's say you and I are in that same accident, and I'm like, "Whoo, that was really scary. I never want to get back in the car again." And you're like, "Ah, it's fine." And you go home to a family that believes that you were in a car accident and cares for you. That increases your level of safety. You were believed, validated, supported. But maybe I go home and I still am caretaking, and my family's not super supportive, and I don't have a lot of space to recover. That sort of compounds my experience that that is unsafe. And if it ever happens to me again, I'm going to be even more unsafe.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you. And we'll talk about the tie-ins because there are some real specific and real tie-ins to the cannabis industry. So we're going to get there.
Yeah.
We're kind of covering some general ground right now. Um, we know there's some common responses to trauma, right? Like Ashley mentioned, anxiety, fear, sadness. Hey, this thing happened. It could happen again. Um, as people gauge their environment and how safe they are, it can disturb our sleep, create headaches, real physiological effects in our body. And we know in our body there are hundreds of chemicals that are stress activated, cortisol being a primary one. And cortisol is a killer. Like stress is a killer and will affect our heart health and blood pressure and a number of things. So this is a key component to pay attention to, as is the behavioral. How do people respond to these perceptions of unsafety or danger? And
Mhm.
sometimes it's becoming uh, highly aware, like hypersensitive of the environment, or distrusting that it could be a safe environment. Some people are more bound to be ready to fight,
Mhm.
right? Or at least meet a situation with aggression. Sometimes it's substance use or substance misuse, right? Where somebody's just attempting to cope and they'll take they'll use whatever it takes to get that sleep, to get some moment of removal from this state of heightened anxiety and stress. So these are common things and very human things. So sometimes we also tend to demonize and not ask more questions, right? Where this person might be self-medicating in a way for their own survival, and the community or the society might be uh, more concerned about making a judgment about what they're doing than what they're responding to.
Yeah.
So let me I'm gonna stop there for just a second, Ashley,
Yeah.
because you and I have talked about, well, why is this particularly, and I know you're not from or embedded in the cannabis world maybe in the same way that I am. Well,
Right.
why do you think this might be particularly important to consider for this community that we participate in?
I think I'm going to start with the two reasons that you just mentioned, and then I'll get into some other stuff. So, two that I think is incredibly important to think about. One is that trauma lives in our body, and there are physiological pieces of how trauma exists within us that that may get real relief by using cannabis, right? Like it is important to understand that body brain connection and that the neurobiology is all connected. So it lives in our body. The other part that you talked about that I think it's important for folks to understand is substance use disorder and how it can manifest in folks just needing to sort of remove themselves from the constant state of heightened awareness and needing to just like check out. And that is a way that they have figured to check out. And so those are two things that are really, I think that folks will see. And it's important to stay non-judgmental when we see those things, because understanding it is folks just trying to cope the best they can. So those are two reasons. Another sort of larger reasons I think it's incredibly important to talk about in this space is because there are particular communities that have been, I would say, largely impacted by things like the war on drugs and other things that have been problematic for certain communities that have created trauma within those communities. And now that cannabis is a legal space, I think that that can be tricky for people, right? I think that there are some folks that have been disproportionately impacted by violence, trauma, and other things. And it's important for us to understand those things in this space.
Absolutely. And those of you who have been in our coursework understand or recognize, I think we don't tiptoe around those subjects. In fact, in the cannabis professional, that's what we lead with. We lead with the history and try to help people understand that cannabis use used to be not only common and non-demonized, but both spiritual and sacred for a lot of communities. Um, Unfortunately, due to the 75 plus year war against cannabis specifically,
Mhm.
not only has the drug become the plant become demonized, but its users have become demonized, and especially communities of color, right? Not only stigmatized, but people have been imprisoned. And when one member of a family is imprisoned, everybody is really imprisoned with them. Not only are you losing often a breadwinner, somebody who's contributing in a significant way to that family's economic success and survival, but the worry for your loved one who's in and what other dangers are they facing that you can't control. And so we know not just families, but entire communities have been impacted. So I think it's critical that we have these kind of conversations and at least try to light some small fires here, right? Because I don't know about y'all, I haven't heard this discussion going on in the cannabis community, and I really think it's worth more talk because we have all been victims of a bad judicial system, right?
Mhm.
We have all, even if somebody in your family hasn't gone to jail, I think most people in the room know what it's like to smoke a joint and be looking over your shoulder. Hey, are the cops around? Is somebody going to turn me in, or my neighbor's going to report the smell of smoke? All that, which often the paranoia, anxiety attributed to the plant is, I think, related to, right?
Yeah.
By itself, yes, the plant can cause anxiety, but boy, when you add um, the danger, as some people say, with dark humor is the most dangerous thing about consuming cannabis is law enforcement,
Mm.
right? Because we know by itself it's not going to kill you, but an interaction with a poor interaction with law enforcement could result in you being harmed, imprisoned, or dying.
Yeah.
And so, please.
So I was, and I don't know, I am sure this is true in other communities. But I also just want to acknowledge that in Portland specifically, which is a predominantly white area, many folks of communities of color and folks of color have been incarcerated because of this. And now there is this thriving legal business that many of those people are unable to participate in because of their legal histories, which has made it disproportionately beneficial for folks that are white that have maybe demonized those communities in the past. So I think that in this space there is extra trauma for those people, for those communities particularly, to engage with dispensaries.
Absolutely. And we can't forget that, right? While some people are making life savings off of this plant, other people are serving life sentences, right?
Thank you.
Plain and simple. And that's why we're partnered with Last Prisoner Project to do, like some of your classmates, you all are formerly incarcerated people that we work with on scholarships and that sort of thing. But we cannot forget, like currently, right now, today, there are over 50,000 prisoners in US jails that are basically political prisoners, nonviolent cannabis using or selling individuals who are just like us. And so let me ask you, Ashley, what are two basic principles of trauma-informed care that you wish everybody on the front lines in this cannabis industry,
Yeah.
from whether I'm a person working the cashier, working the floor to the CEO, what are two things you wish people knew?
That's a great question. I've thought about this one a lot because there's a million things that I want people to know, so it's hard to distill down to two. And I really appreciate that we can't do everything all at once. So if there were to, I think the number one would be to understand that people's behaviors and responses, to try to see them through a trauma-informed lens. So understand that when you are encountering customers and colleagues, they may have had experiences of trauma or are currently experiencing trauma and toxic stress, and that may impact the way that they interact with people, right? And so understanding that when customers come in and they're difficult, or if you're working with folks that are difficult, that we work and are working with folks that may have had trauma or are experiencing toxic stress. So their behavior is not a reflection of who they are. So trying to stay out of judgment would be the number one. And then the number two, I would say, would be to create safety for people, because that is the one and only way, which for me encompasses a lot of things, right? Like trustworthiness, transparency, like plain language for people not feeling like dispensaries or jails, all of those sorts of pieces, but making sure safety for customers and people working within the industry is paramount. That people feel safe coming to your establishment, that they feel welcome, wanted, and needed there, and that employees in that industry also feel safe. So safety and then non-judgment.
Great. And you talked a little bit, and I don't know if everybody could see when you were doing the hand
Oh,
model of when we flip our lid. So when we do experience trauma and things go offline, what are some of those behaviors that I might encounter if I'm working in a cannabis
yeah.
store that um, could at their source be related to or affected by trauma that I might make a quick judgment about and say, oh, this person is being a jerk, this person is being too aggressive or forceful, or what are those some of those misattributions I might be making that could actually be something else?
Yep. So this gets really tricky because I think all behavior should be viewed through a trauma-informed lens, but that's giving everybody the benefit of the doubt, right? Because some people are difficult, challenging, it's not necessarily that. However, it is going to be things like aggression, yelling, big emotions, difficultness, misunderstanding, attention and memory are impacted, having to explain the same thing over and over again. But I might illustrate this better through a scenario if I could a little bit.
Please.
Um, so I think of, there's a couple of different dispensaries that I frequent around my neighborhood. And, one of them, you walk in and it's very closed off, right? It doesn't feel very welcoming. There is a glass window, double paned. You slide your ID through, and then they buzz you in, and um, they're they're lovely, but it's challenging in there. It's not very well signed. There's a lot of information. It's just not set up very conducive. So if I walk in, I can immediately be like, oof, this is activating for me to walk in and have to do this situation. Because to me, it feels a lot like jail. Feels like I'm going to visit somebody in a place of incarceration, which I understand protection, making employees feel safe, but there are other dispensaries that I walk into and they're open, wide open. I feel welcome. People are engaging with me immediately. So if I walk in and I see that place, I immediately might get stressed, right? I immediately might get activated by that. So then somebody takes my ID and I go in and they're trying to explain things to me and I don't understand. And I start to get aggressive and aggravated, well, that may make the employee behind the counter respond to me in a particular way, right? They may be like, whoa, 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 calm down. It may start to flip their lid. And I could get aggressive back, right? And I may feel disrespected. You may see some behavior where I am demanding, where I'm yelling, sort of those sorts of things. And it really is these pieces of activation all along the way that are happening that we may not interpret as activating, but it is for the person that's experiencing it. Was that clear? I hope it was.
It is, and I've heard you say in other venues that um, understanding this language or understanding trauma-informed care doesn't mean we're absolving people of their personal responsibility or their
No,
behavior, right? It's
correct.
seeking to better understand. So it's not like we say, oh, well, that person's probably been through some trauma. They can mistreat our staff, right?
Absolutely not. And I appreciate you saying that because you're right. Trauma informed care is not saying, oh, yeah, you can come in and behave this way and that's okay. But it is maybe trying to eliminate as many things as you can up front that could be overwhelming or activating for people. And then when you do encounter these behaviors, having a very clear policy of like, sorry, this is what we allow you to do here. You're welcome back when you're different behavior, whatever. But yes, you don't have to accept any abuse, harassment, because another important part of trauma-informed care is ensuring that employees feel safe working, ensuring that people feel safe in the environment to be able to provide service. Because they can't provide good service if they feel unsafe, and customers should never make them feel unsafe.
Absolutely. And part of that is safety protocols. If you're working for a shop and you don't know what the safety protocols are, if somebody should come in and rob your shop or is acting in a way that you're thinking, hey, they're not shopping, they're scoping out, they're
Yeah.
looking at the cameras, they're looking at our security features. Like if there's no training for you as an employee about what to do, if there's no silent alarm button, if you don't know what would go down if that were to happen to you tomorrow, that's a problem and a red flag. And I know you're not always empowered as a staff person to call attention to those things, but you do always have the right to walk away and find another job that serves that is willing to listen to you or willing to protect you better. And so
Mhm.
I'm glad you mentioned the responsibility of the employer. And I want to turn to the group here because I've dominated your time, Ashley, asking you questions. Um, we got a smart crowd here. What questions do you all have for Ashley or about on this topic?
I'm also, yeah, bit of a rambler, so I'm sorry if those.
No, this is great. Anyone else?
I just want to say thank you, Ashley, because I'm on the path to becoming a trauma-informed therapist. So it's all very useful information. I'm not going to be in a retail environment per se, but I am going to be teaching people about healing through plant medicine and consulting. And so I'll be dealing with a lot of those scenarios. So thank you for walking us through that. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for your work. That's really exciting. I'm so excited to see these different therapies applied to this. I think particularly psilocybin and cannabis can be so important. Folks is healing and moving through this stuff. Yeah, it has worked wonders in remapping brains, right? Because that's really what this is about, is remapping the brain from trauma. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Actually,
Yes.
I'm sorry, Susie. In the chat, John asked, "Hey, could you define toxic stress and as opposed to what?"
Yep, absolutely. And thanks for that question, John. So all of us experience tolerable stress. Tolerable stress is what gets you up in the morning. It's what gets you to this class by noon instead of 12:30, right? It like is all of the things that we experience on a day-to-day basis that like get us moving and going, right? When you meet a new person, tolerable stress, those are all, or positive stress, those are all good things. And then there's tolerable stress. Most of us experience tolerable stress most of the time. And that is where like maybe work is stressful, but at home you've got lots of community and friends and family and people that you can like download with, and you have a lot of support. Or maybe home's really stressful and you are caretaking, but you go to work and you've got tons of friends there and you feel like you can offload some of that stress. That is where tolerable stress is. The difference between tolerable and toxic stress are two things. It is first the duration of time that you are exposed to that stress. And the second piece is whether or not you have support. So the difference is folks that are experiencing toxic stress don't have any of that support. They are stressed at work, they're stressed at home, they're stressed in their personal lives. They don't have that community. And one thing about human beings is we tend to isolate when we start to feel that stress. And so it is difficult to get to tolerable from toxic if that's our response.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, good question, John. And Madison, what you got?
Yeah, so it's kind of a vague question, but how can I gently open people up to the idea of being trauma informed? And I guess to that, like, what does that look like in the workplace versus just the community?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. I really appreciate it. I think that it's a couple of ways to do it. I'm a huge proponent of attraction rather than promotion. And so living it, right? Like I just do it as much as I can. And when I think about calling people in, that's what I try to do. And so when I see somebody, for example, being judgmental about somebody's behavior, it's about asking a question like, oh, tell me more about why you think that, or tell me more, it's being curious about their behavior and being willing to challenge that then with your own opinion. I do think it is incredibly important to start with that curiosity, because I think if we start with a challenge, people will automatically get defensive, right? Their lid will flip and they'll feel challenged, and then we start to respond that way. But I think that this idea of asking questions, tell me more about that, help me understand why you believe that, help me understand your behavior, and then leading with empathy and helping people understand the difference between empathy and sympathy. Where empathy is really about thinking of the other person and what their experience is and just trying to connect with that, where sympathy is making it about myself and how that behavior impacted me or what I want to see different or how I relate to that. And so those pieces would be the things that I would do. Live it, encourage empathy, and then call people in and ask questions as much as possible.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
And it is so hard to not make judgment, right? Our brain tries to make sense of our environment and people we encounter. And so to stop and instead of making judgment, to be curious. And I know you model this because you ask that question frequently. Tell me more about what you just said. And it makes the speaker slow down a second and say, hey, well, did I just say that off the cuff out of anger? Or what did I mean by that? Or maybe I didn't mean anything by that. And Ashley's helping me understand that that could have been taken a couple different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And I need to explain myself better, right?
Yeah.
So giving people some space and some grace to define what they meant or redefine what they intended to say.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean that we look past egregious examples or allow people to say things or do things in the workplace or otherwise that make us or other people unsafe or challenged or threatened.
Exactly.
But it does, when there's ambiguity, not jump in to say, hey, well, that's not what I believe, that's not what you should believe, and we gotta fight about this. But asking for clarity, because sometimes people, y'all know how it works. Somebody, the more they explain themselves, the more they realize, oh, well, that did sound like a jackass thing to say, and I don't really believe that, and I would hate to think that you think I believe that. And now I've had a moment to explain that, and it won't happen again, kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes it gives us that grace is a powerful thing, and so taking some opportunity. Wendy asked, any insights about using cannabis as a medicine across usage methods for panic attacks and I won't put you on the spot, Ashley, because I know I don't think medical training is your background. I'm not saying that you don't know,
I don't
but
know. I'm willing to say I do not know.
but I will say, Wendy, of course, we would encourage you to bring some of those questions back to Dr. Giles and Dr. Duncan Lynch, who love those questions and would be more than happy to take them on.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, Ashley, I am going to put you on the spot. We talked before class with one of our students here who is going to be a licensee in a state and open their own place. If you were opening your own cannabis dispensary or a lounge, what are a couple of things that you would hope I would experience in your place of business that would show that you're considering trauma-informed care? Are there a couple of things that you would hope you or your staff would be reflecting?
Yes. Thinking about physical space, I think, is incredibly important, particularly if it's a cannabis lounge where folks are going to be able to come in and use. And so, like, ensuring that people feel safe in the space. Is it set up in a way that people don't feel like they're blocked off or like they feel like they can see things, that they are just feeling as though they have as much control in the space as possible? I don't know what the laws are in Vegas. I think of things like having, a bouncer or door person to like increase that level of safety. I also think of things like signage and information that is out that indicates to people that they are welcome, wanted, and needed here. So things that help folks understand that you're LGBTQ 2A plus friendly, right? Things to help folks understand that they are coming into an environment that they are going to be safe and they're not going to be discriminated against, right? Like, and those things to people that don't need them go unnoticed, right? It makes very little difference to folks that don't need to see those equality is for all signs, but for folks that it matters to, it makes a big difference. And so keeping in mind all of those things, and I also think in terms of comfort, understanding that folks that have experienced trauma and toxic stress, one of the 4 major impacts to the brain is sensory input. And so lessening sensory input, ensuring that there is not too much sensory input to create a sense of safety for folks.
Thank you. Boy, I hope you get a license. Leslie says, hey, I want to reinforce how important it is to educate dispensary employees on appropriate methods for de-escalating toxic behaviors and how to handle unsafe escalations. You want to talk about that some? Anything that you, well, yeah, are there things that, let me ask it this way, are there things that you would hope through a business's training, because I know we don't have the time to cover all the topics now, but what are some topics within that that you would hope an employer takes time to work through with their employer? What as an employee should I be looking for from an employer?
I think that's a great question, Trey. And I think it's really important for the shop or the dispensary to provide these things. One example that you gave about the button. So like, do employees know what to do when if somebody were to come in and rob them? And I know that that is an extreme situation, but that and other disasters, right? Is there a plan for those folks? And in terms of educating things on different de-escalation methods, I would say there would be a handful of things I think all employees should understand. Trauma in the brain 101, so people understand the way that the brain responds to those things, why it might responding. And then I would do de-escalation practice. And so I am a huge fan, as you know, Trey, and as Grace knows, of practicing things as though they were happening, right? Because our brain does not know the difference between real life and practice. And so giving employees opportunities to de-escalate different situations, right? And every dispensary is going to be different in terms of what are the problems, right? And so whatever is happening in your particular area, locale, what you see, are you seeing lots of folks coming in with fake IDs and then responding in a way that's escalated, and how do we handle that? Are we seeing folks come in that are just feeling disrespected, and how do we handle that? But ensuring that folks have practice, I would say, is important. One of the most important.
Thank you. Thank you. And a question here, and I don't know if we have an answer here. Does cannabis have negative effects on trauma response clients with paranoia or anxiety? I will say we do know that cannabis can accentuate and exacerbate our existing emotions. And y'all know that, right? You can, if I'm already feeling sad, already feeling anxious, cannabis can crank up the volume. It can turn it down too. But sometimes, depending on what I smoke, how much I smoke, where I am when I do it, my sense of safety, I could be turning up the volume on that stuff rather than turning down the volume. So that's why a cannabis employee is critical to help identify product selection and coaching up on dosing. And the same thing goes, I think, when we talk about psychedelics, we talk about set and setting. So what is my mindset and what is the setting where I'm consuming it? Is this consuming that joint at home in a safe environment with a friend is very different than how a lot of people used to do it behind a dumpster somewhere where you won't get caught, or off in the woods hoping the smell doesn't give you away, right? So does this person even have a safe environment where they can consume? So those are some of the things. I don't know that we have a definitive answer for you on that, but some of the things to consider, and why the role of the cannabis employee is critical to help somebody consider those things.
Can I say something just about trauma in the brain that
Please.
So what we understand about trauma in the brain is that, like I said earlier, if folks have experienced trauma or toxic stress, they may experience a feeling of threat in an area that it doesn't necessarily exist, because our brain predicts what's going to happen. So if we have had negative experiences over and over, that's what our brain's going to predict. And so trauma and toxic stress can absolutely increase anxiety and paranoia. And so I'd say, similar to what Trey said, set and setting, what we know is that the brain does that and that happens. So I imagine that set and setting have a lot to do with where somebody is at.
Let me ask the group. Oh, Madison, that's what I was going to ask, if anybody had questions.
Yeah, so a minute ago you had said something about sensory input can be impacted by trauma. I've done a lot of trauma work myself just because everything I've been through, and that's something that is never talked about. And I also have sensory issues. Like, as I said before, I was recently diagnosed with autism. So can you just talk a little bit more about that? Because no one ever talks about that.
Absolutely. Yeah. There are 4 major impacted parts of the brain from trauma: executive functioning, which we talked about, the flip lid, that's reasoning, decision-making, emotional regulation. And then there's attention and memory. And then finally, sensory input. And I agree, I don't think enough people talk about how sensory input can be impactful for people. And it happens twofold. I actually ask folks to typically do an exercise with me when I train, and I ask them to close their eyes and think of a smell from childhood that brings them joy, and then tell me what it is. And people do it pretty quickly. And the reason for that is because we can recall memories and feelings from our senses. We have a neurobiology, so they're very much connected. Similarly, the way that we can experience that joy, sensory input can activate us. So if there is a smell that is associated closely with trauma for us, that smell can be activating. And we might not even know why, because our neurobiology just sort of happens. Like, we all of a sudden can be like, oof, I am feeling really agitated and I'm not sure why. And then once we are feeling agitated, we are incapable of making connection and meaning with the sensory input. So we make connection and meaning from sight, sound, taste, hearing, smell, right? Like, that's the input that we're getting all the time, that we make meaning about. And like, that's how we exist in this world. And when our lid is flipped, trauma is an inability to make those connections in meaning. And so when we are getting too much sensory input, our bodies and brains just can't process it, and it leads to more anxiety and stress. We need less sensory input, or sensory input that calms us. So I suggest to folks, like, hey, if there's a smell from childhood that isn't like gasoline, get a candle of it and put it in your room, because that can help you calm yourself, right? If there is a smell that you can fill your space with, or a sight or a picture, do that, because that sensory input can help bring our prefrontal cortex back in alignment.
Thank you. And just thank you for being here today and talking about this topic. We talk about reflecting the spirit of the plant, and being able to hear one another, being able to not just jump to conclusions or make a judgment, and to ask, hey, tell me more about that, is all part of that, right? Considering, hey, this behavior from this person might not be because they're a jerk. They might have good reason to be acting like this. And additionally, something Ashley said earlier about her experience going to 2 different dispensaries, and one that feels very locked up, very intrusive, and one that feels a lot more open. Consider, or please remember, a lot of our first-time consumers, our visitors from out of state who are really excited about this. What kind of experience are you setting up for this person, right? We know that some people in their past, the only experience they've had with cannabis is one that's involves risk. That they're risking their own safety and even own freedom to participate, to consume this plant. How do we want to change that perception? How in your workplace, even if it's not your shop, you're just I'm an employee. I don't own this place. I don't get to control everything, but we can still have a profound effect on a customer's experience. So I'll ask you always to think about that. What are the things you're doing to help a customer answer the question, am I safe? Right? What are we doing? And so please think about those things because they're critical, because we're trying to redefine what it means to be a cannabis consumer, what it means to sell cannabis legally. We have to create some cognitive dissonance in people's minds where they think the experience is one thing, and now it can be something very different, something much more positive, something much more healing, something much more loving. And I know that you all are a reflection of that. So, but I will encourage us all to always ask that question. Ashley, thank you for your focus, for really bringing a lot of love and passion to what you do. I think we can feel that. And thanks for helping us start this conversation, you all. Please light small fires in your communities about this topic. Ask your business owners, ask your dispensaries, hey, what are you doing to consider people who have experienced trauma? That's a good question that they might not have an answer for yet, but follow up because it matters. They might not have ever had this exposure. So thank you all very much. Ashley, thank you very much.
Thank you, Trey.
Thank you so much.
Can I just say thank you so
Please.
much for having me, Trey, and for having this conversation in this space. It's so important. And so all of you being here and being willing to do this work and have this conversation is so valuable. So thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And for you starting this conversation.
No, absolutely. And I don't usually ask this of you all because it sounds self-serving, but I will have this content on YouTube within 3 days is my promise. Please feel free to share that, post it up. And that's the way we can get the word out and get people curious about this topic. And that's one of those ways we can light these small fires. So I don't usually ask that, but considering what this topic is, please consider doing that.
Can I give 2 book suggestions before we leave?
Yeah.
So there's 2 books that if folks are interested in these topics, they are really good places to start. The first is Trauma in Recovery by Dr. Judith Herman. It's brilliant. And then the other that I really think is important for folks that do any work is The Age of Overwhelm by Laura van der Noot-Lipsky. And that talks about how people that work with folks that have experienced trauma, but also just living in this world, how we deal with overwhelm and help other people deal with that toxic stress. And then The Body Keeps the Score is another really great one. By, Bessel van der Beek. Bessel van der Beek is his name, who does The Body Keeps the Score, which is a great book about the neurobiology, the brain-body connection of trauma. So those are the 3 that I suggest.
Thank you very much. So yeah, there's lots of information out there. Also on YouTube, lots of good information. There's all, you got to wade through, but there's good information there as well. Thank you, Paul, for posting that up. And just a reminder, we are, or a notice, Tuesday night student lounge, we're going to postpone because there's a little presidential debate going on, and we're not going to compete with that. We want you to get all the information you can for a very important election. And thank you all very much. Have a great weekend. Thank you for sharing your Saturday with us.
Yeah.
And have a good afternoon.
Bye, y'all. Thanks.